Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest is Molly Worthen, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In a recent conversation with Seen and Unseen's Belle Tyndall and Justin Brierley, you mentioned higher education was your backup plan and that you believed your initial calling was to serve as a journalist. With the job market in the humanities being what it is, I'm not sure what it says about your gambling history there or wagering history if you plan on the humanities being your backup plan. But regardless, you managed to do both very well. You serve on the faculty there at the University of North Carolina and include on a variety of topics to publications such as The New Yorker, New York Times, The Atlantic, Politico, Foreign Policy, Slate, and Christianity Today. With such a combination of skills usually being the foundation for what we reference as a public intellectual. To start, can you begin by sharing how your writing voice developed over the course of your career? And in what practices did you invest to be able to serve such audiences?
I appreciate the question, and it implies a level of deliberate action and planning that I don't think I really engaged in. I just followed my own curiosity and instincts, I suppose. I don't recall anyone early in my education giving me that cliche speech about needing to find your passion. I think if I had heard that, it would have kind of paralyzed me, wouldn't really have known what to do with it. And I'm always telling the students I talk to ignore that message from the culture. I just think there are a few people who really have clarity about what they want to do and how very early on, but I think they're the exception. I was really interested from being fifth grade on, doing a big project on the lost island of Atlantis, where I was moved to recreate the island based on, a range of sources I had found, both from modeling clay, but then also from gingerbread and candy, which then after my presentation to the class, I offered, we broke it up and ate it. And I think from that point on...
Probably a crowd favorite then at that point.
That's right, yeah. But I guess I was just really entranced by the opportunity to try to enter as fully as possible a world that was not my own. And I guess that is the through line that explains the classes I was drawn to, the reading, the twin interests in history, especially religious history and journalism, especially journalism focused on religion. And so, I think I just read a lot and read a lot across a wide range of fiction and nonfiction. And that to me is the key to kind of developing one's ear for how a paragraph ought to sound. And I began kind of bumbling into short-term journalistic assignments that gave me a chance to just ask a lot of questions and hone the art of interviewing and getting people to talk about themselves. So, I had a few early experiences that were really formative. Maybe the main one was getting some funding from my college the summer after my sophomore year to go to this rather remote location in north central Alberta in Western Canada to do some very amateur ethnographic fieldwork with a community of Russian Orthodox Old Believers who are a sort of obscure sect that broke away from the main body of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 17th century and were persecuted first by the czars and then the communists, and their diaspora is all over the place. So there's a remote community of them 4 hours northeast of Edmonton.
Oh, wow.
And I went up there. I had a mentor named David Goa, who was a professor associated with the University of Alberta, who kind of helped me get my feet under me. And that was my first time really trying to break into a pretty isolated community and really try to kind of learn how do you observe and describe a worldview and a kind of a way of being that's not your own. I never managed to publish anything out of that. It resulted in like a giant pile of field notes. But it really, it was my first time really falling in love with that whole endeavor. I've really tried to kind of get as close as possible to the asymptote that is another human's experience.
Thank you. What habits then, as your career progressed, as your education progressed, have you sought to develop then that would allow you to also continue to expand that voice as a writer and to refine it?
Interviewing is kind of my default conversation mode.
Hmm.
It's what I do in social situations when I feel awkward. It's not just something I do when I'm deliberately working on a story. But I suppose just because of my temperament and that's kind of how I manage my own combination of being an introvert, but also being interested in other people. So you do a lot of that. You have lots of conversations where you're asking people about themselves and learning how to overcome various kinds of friction points and obstacles that one encounters. I guess you get better at it. I really found my voice as a writer, and I guess began to develop something I could call a vocation in my first big writing project, which began as a seminar paper in college. I took in a course called The Art of Biography. We had to pick a subject for our final paper. It could be anyone, famous or not, living or dead. I really wanted to write about this professor I had at Yale who had a previous career that was sort of shrouded in mystery as a foreign service officer and kind of highly placed person in the State Department under the really peaking in the Reagan years. But he had been kind of posted all over the world and dropped kind of breadcrumbs of stories about it over the years. But I wanted an excuse to ask him questions. It turned out he had this huge archive that was untapped. He had taken over 25,000 pages of contemporaneous verbatim notes of every conversation he had been a part of or overheard. And that's just during his time serving in the Reagan administration alone. And no historian had ever looked at it. A lot of it had been classified, seized by the FBI during the Iran-Contra investigation. And it evolved from a little piddling seminar paper into my senior thesis for my history major. And then a professor mentor found funding to basically support me for a year after graduation to turn it into a book. The guy I was writing about, he cooperated, and I got to know him both, as a kind of subject of a professional biography, but I also got to know him personally. I became pretty good friends with his ex-wife. Nothing teaches you that your mentor has feet of clay, like getting to know his ex-wife and kind of coming around on the other side of that to really still be full of admiration for him, but see him as a mortal human being who makes mistakes. But that project, which resulted in a book that is 2/3 a kind of conventional diplomatic biography and 1/3 really memoir written in the first person about my experience as an undergraduate in the wake of 9/11, what kind of young Americans were hungering for at that point in culture. It helped me, I think, pull together a lot of the big questions that have motivated me ever since. And it gave me a real taste for both archive work as well as doing a lot of oral history and talking to people. And so I've tried to kind of combine those two ever since.
Yeah. Thank you. Most scholars begin their efforts by focusing on what the guild will ask of them, historians, for example, then what historians and the historical associations with which they, share and fellowship ask of them, and then expand their voice, perhaps to then serve wider groups of audience members through publications, as I talked about earlier, that you've contributed to, like the New Yorker, Slate, Christianity Today. You had this project with, Charles Hill, that then led to publication. But in some ways, you sort of seem to have started your career more in reverse, where you contributed large numbers of pieces to these more popular periodicals, but then also have learned to hone your voice as a scholar. In what ways do you sort of find the ability to shift, based on audience or outlet that you're trying to reach?
I went to graduate school because I wanted to be a religion journalist, and I felt I had this kind of spotty knowledge. I knew a lot about Russian Orthodoxy, and I had taken the odd class in other corners of religious and history and theology. I knew nothing, though, about American religious history. I couldn't have told you the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist. But I had this sense I wanted to be able to pitch articles to editors of American publications. I had this instinct that, I don't know, there was a certain shallowness to the coverage of especially conservative Christianity. I think the landscape has improved a lot. There's a number of working journalists now who I really admire. It was less true in the early 2000s. So I strategically chose a dissertation topic, broadly conservative American evangelicals, that would be a vehicle for learning about those things. And of course, to understand the 20th century and religion in the 20th century, you have to do your homework really all the way back. So it became a vehicle for doing, proper spade work in New Testament studies and patristics and medieval history too, which I'm really grateful for. And as you say, I was freelancing from graduate school on, constantly looking for connections. Where does my research kind of dovetail with something that seems like it could connect with today's headlines? Striking out way more often than having success. Just sending a lot of cold emails, but always seeing the two endeavors as connected. And I suppose I still see them as very connected. Especially as someone who did not grow up in any religious tradition, I found it really helpful to be in kind of the discipline of putting my tentative conclusions that I was drawing from my historical research, archives, and my reading into conversation with what I was learning from living, breathing members of or descendants of these communities, kind of bouncing ideas off of people I was interviewing, as I was developing my historical knowledge. I found that to be a really useful exercise. It has also always seemed to me that there are so many similarities between the work we do in the classroom and public writing. In both cases, you have a very limited amount of time or space, and you're trying to reach a smart, fairly curious, or at least sort of open audience that probably doesn't have much background
Depends
in
on
the
the day.
subject.
Whether they got
Depends.
sleep or not.
Exactly. Same is true of the average person opening their New York Times in the morning too. And you have to make hard choices, right? Any professor putting together a syllabus at the beginning of the semester has faced these dilemmas, right? Like how do you reduce something really complex to the limitations of your 12 or 15 week semester, divided up into these 50 or 75-minute chunks of time? How do you simplify in a way that is helpful, that yields to the demands of the genre, but doesn't compromise too much, doesn't leave the reader with a false impression of the reality of the complexity of history and theology? Those challenges are the same, I think.
Yeah.
There's a kind of seamlessness. I do think, in academia, across the humanistic fields, there definitely are some bad habits that we are exposed to and kind of inadvertently trained in when it comes to our prose. But I think the same things that make for good journalistic writing, clarity, vivid examples, avoiding jargon, these are generally characteristics of good writing in a history journal, or certainly in a book, right? I'm grateful to be in a discipline, history, that I do think lends itself maybe more than some others to writing, for a broader audience. But I see the disciplines as very much aligned.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask you now about your own story and then the details, some of which you've already mentioned. You grew up in Glen Ellen, Illinois. So speaking of evangelicals, within a stone's throw, so to say, of Wheaton College. But then you moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where you earned your undergraduate and doctoral degrees. Just the discernment process then, can you expand a little bit upon what allowed you or compelled you then to pursue doctoral work?
I was good at school and liked school. And I suffered from a real, I think, an impoverished imagination when it comes to appreciating the range of stuff that grown-ups do.
All right. I'm
So
doing it. So, and I enjoy being here. So I'm just going to stay here as long as they'll let me.
exactly.
Riff.
Exactly. That is exactly right. I mean, I flirted with a few other things. I remember sending out some queries about maybe becoming a speechwriter in DC. My first project had been very much about the Washington scene and the State Department and politics and so forth. So that was a sensible avenue to explore. But I was really, my first love was the history of religion, and I wanted to become someone who was qualified to write about religion in our own time. And so I thought I'll apply to a couple of graduate programs, and I don't know what I would have done. Of course, we all know, right? Like those of us who have been in academia long enough have some exposure to the grim reality of graduate admissions. It is such a crapshoot. I easily could have not gotten in, and I don't know what I would be doing. I think I was very intimidated by the entry points. If I had attempted to go directly into journalism and really work my way up, I think my temperament is kind of risk averse. And so the idea of, signing up for a PhD where, okay, I don't know what's at the other end, but at least I have my life sorted out for 6 years. Someone is paying me a modest but sufficient amount to read books and write about them. And that sounds great. So if that counts as discerning one's vocation, I guess I was doing that. And then I became socialized, I think, into really the luxuries of even doing journalistic work from a perch in a university with a great library and a community of really smart, interesting people. The longer you're kind of in that space, I think the more you want to, as you advance in a PhD program, you want to kind of give it a go yourself. And so I found myself at the other end of it, thinking I should at least apply for academic positions.
Yeah.
And so, my husband's a historian as well, so it took us a little while to solve the two-body problem, but we've been at University of North Carolina for 14 years now.
I was going to ask you the discernment process that then brought you and brought your husband then to Chapel Hill, in part because you indicated that there were positions for both of you there, which I think it's interesting to note. You're, a U.S. religious historian. He's an international contemporary historian there too, which has got to make for some interesting conversations, or at least different perspectives on conversations that you have there at home. But yeah,
it's ideal. Yeah, I think we're close enough. Our field are close enough that we can read each other's work, but not so close that the department could not justify hiring both of us.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, what brought you then also to Chapel Hill, in addition to the opportunities, and what opportunities have you found while being there?
One thing you kind of sign up for when you embark on a humanities PhD and you want a conventional academic career is you kind of give up control over where you live. There are so few jobs in any given year. So we never planned to move to this part of the country, had no organic connections to it. As you said, I'm from Glen Ellen, Illinois. My husband's from Toronto, Ontario. But I have felt really fortunate to have landed here, and it's an especially rich place to teach and write about American religious history, because it's the flagship public school in a complicated purple state that is in the South, and has 82% of our students come from the state of North Carolina, and among them they represent a huge range of personal perspectives on religion. But the nature of North Carolina is such that, even if they personally are staunch atheists, they have probably grown up around religious people. And you don't have to convince them that religion is important and relevant to their lives. It's very different than teaching in the Northeast, where, especially when I taught about conservative Christianity, I often felt as if I was teaching the history of Martian religion. Not that there are plenty of conservative Christians in New Haven, Connecticut, but it's a more of a subculture in a way that it's more embedded here. And I've really loved being with students at a time in their lives when many of them are sorting out their own relationship to the faith tradition they grew up with, or maybe they grew up with none and are meeting people who have different views of the universe, and they're wrestling through that. And so those conversations are really rewarding.
Yeah. Thank you. You've graciously shared your story of your conversion to Christianity with a number of audiences. because it happened after you were already established in your career. But in what ways, if any, has it impacted your service as a public intellectual and your service as a scholar and a teacher?
I've been a Christian for 3.5 years, was evangelized by a local Southern Baptist pastor I was writing a magazine article about, and he evangelized me, and I converted very much as a super cerebral historian through a pretty intense, very kind of academic study of the historical evidence for and against the Christian account of the resurrection. So my process was really my conversion to Christianity in that sense was quite integrated with my academic work, and I have found it to be really intellectually exciting. And I think on reflection, becoming a Christian has not drastically changed my approach to the historical method or how I teach. And I think that's partly because in retrospect, I see that to some degree I was always borrowing Christian assumptions. I mean, I think my whole anthropology, my theory of what humans are like and why they deserve our interest, why they have dignity, it doesn't really have any foundations outside of at least a theistic framework, if not an expressly Christian one. And in my teaching from the beginning, I've always been attentive to the places in which there is tension between the accounts offered by more secular-minded scholars focused on material, economic, political factors, and the understanding of Christian historical subjects. So I've always thought it was important and interesting to draw my students' attention to the way in which, the explanations that modern professional historians offer for the First Great Awakening might, are different, but I think complementary to the understanding of Christians there who narrated it as work of the Holy Spirit. And I've always been committed to making the case to students, many of whom are Christian of some variety, that you don't have to choose one or the other.
Yeah.
You don't have to, turn off your faith in order to do this historical project. But becoming a Christian has certainly, it's attuned me to questions that I wasn't really paying attention to before. As much as throughout my career up until that point, I really thought of myself as a very open-minded seeker. My intellectual hero was and remains, he's still one of my heroes, the pragmatist philosopher William James, whose whole epistemology is premised on a certain openness, a commitment to holding your presuppositions in a light grip and being willing to revise your working theory of the universe when you get new evidence. And I always thought that described me. As I really got into investigating Christianity, I realized I had not been as open as I fancied myself. And I had functionally occupied a closed universe in which I wasn't really willing to entertain the possibility of supernatural intervention. But once you conclude that the preponderance of historical evidence supports the resurrection of Jesus, if you're willing to suspend your disbelief in the supernatural, and I had to confront the fact that I just didn't have the warrant for my commitment to a closed universe that I thought that I had. Once you're willing to allow that, everything's possible, and you have to start. You have to take off the blinkers.
Yeah.
So my next kind of research project following my conversion was a pretty intense investigation of contemporaneous claims of miraculous healing. I got really interested in reading the literature on this, learning especially from scholars like the New Testament scholar at Asbury Theological Seminary, Craig Keener, who's written some really great books on kind of compendia of miracle testimonies, both in our own time and New Testament times. Also doing a number of interviews with a range of people, but mostly Christians who are in academia in some way, but also have had experiences that have really attuned them to the supernatural in a way that is countercultural, shall we say, in the kind of mainstream of Western academia. And that's a project. So I ended up writing a newspaper article on this question of is it a worthwhile endeavor to attempt to scientifically prove claims of miraculous healings?
Yeah.
And that's a project that it never would have occurred to me to take that on or ask those questions prior to my conversion. So, that's maybe an example of how I'm just slowly I'm grappling with this huge epistemological shift. I mean, it's not a one and done thing. Like it's very hard to get out of the epistemological grooves you've operated in for your whole adult life. And I'm really still very much at the beginning of that process.
Thank you. I want to talk more about your second and third book. We've already talked about your first book, The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost, the book about Charles Hill. But then you have two other books, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Reason in American Evangelicalism, which Oxford University Press published in 2013. And then also Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, which Forum Books published in 2025. If you would start by just sharing what it was that drew you to those particular topics then, and what you learned by working your way through them.
In the case of Apostles of Reason, that book grew out of my dissertation. I sought to construct a dissertation project that would give me a pretty well-rounded vehicle for learning about conservative Protestantism in America. And I had become intrigued by a pattern in the historiography. Many of the kind of the major books on conservative, majority white, post-war American Protestantism really foregrounded thinkers and traditions that we broadly classify as being in the Reformed theological tradition. And I was just curious about this and wondered about whether it really represented what I was already coming to sense was a pretty messy diversity of theological streams that feed into American evangelicalism. So I thought, what if I just kind of come up with a plan for archive digging that will give me the chance to take core samples from a range of traditions, from kind of Pentecostal to Churches of Christ to Southern Baptist, some of these more kind of ecumenical higher educational institutions, Bible colleges, places like Wheaton College. It depended to some extent on where I could get access, but that was my basic idea. And I thought I'm gonna challenge and revise the great kind of fathers of modern American evangelical history. Historians like Mark Noll and Joel Carpenter and people like this. And I ended up writing a book that in many ways tells the story of why it is the case that the Reformed evangelicals, who are proportionately speaking, a fairly small fraction of American evangelicalism, why they have indeed come to kind of punch above their weight and have this disproportionate influence, I think has been true since Puritan times. And it ends up being a book really about kind of the intellectual fights and debates within evangelicalism, the intellectual backstory that yields the public-facing Christian right that we come to associate with the 70s and 80s. But broadly, I was interested in questions of intellectual authority. Why, and what is it about evangelicalism that is sort of uniquely modern and Western? And I do think that evangelical Protestantism grew up in constant conversation and tension with the Enlightenment, with the Pietist revivals, and the evolving, increasingly pluralistic reality of the secular West in a way that is special to evangelicalism. But I think that interest in why do people accede to certain sources of authority when there's no immediate source of duress? Why do they listen to the people they listen to? Why do they adopt certain theories of the universe? This is what's interesting to me. So the third book is a history of the idea of charisma as both a religious concept, so charisma in the New Testament sense of the history of revivals and tongues and trance speaking and all the ways in which American Christians have looked for the intrusion of divine power into their lives, and how that's intertwined with the history of charisma in the political sense that we've kind of inherited from the sociologist Max Weber, the sense of authority that does not reside in tradition or institutional position or the possession of a military force, but has some kind of ineffable residence in the leader as a person, and is this relationship between a leader and followers that is usually quite baffling to people outside it. And that ended up being a book that is partly about what happens to the religious impulse as a society becomes more secular, as the authority and affiliation with traditional institutions of organized religion declines. My operating assumption, I think my whole career, certainly predating my conversion, has always been that humans are in a fundamental sense religious creatures. We have this impulse to connect ourselves with a transcendent story, a transcendent source of meaning. And just because we no longer go to church as often as we once did on Sundays, it doesn't mean that that impulse has evaporated. That impulse has simply moved. So the question is, where has it gone? And my working hypothesis going into that third book was maybe one interesting place to explore is in that relationship between leaders and followers.
Thank you. If we add back in your first book into the equation, book on Charles Hill, when you look at those three books that you've done so far to date in your career, which one have you found most vocationally satisfying?
Oh, man. I mean, they played such different roles. I almost think I don't have like a big enough sample of books I've written to, because, one was really my first sort of finding my voice as a writer, learning what it is to be a historian. The dissertation, anyone who's been through a PhD knows the dissertation is a particular job. The thing that was most satisfying about Apostles of Reason was the feedback I got from a lot of people who grew up in evangelical traditions, saying that they really saw themselves in their own formation in the story I was telling. And that was so gratifying, especially because I did not grow up in it, to hear that I had at least captured something. But as I formed the ideas for my approach to my third book, I hit on what I think is kind of it's going to be my approach to pretty much any big book project going forward, which is the only part of a book project that you, the author, can control is what you learn in the course of researching and writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
You can't control how it's received. I don't even think you can really control if it's any good. Like there's this way in which a book sort of takes on a life of its own, and it kind of, once it's underway, it becomes the book it wants to become. And you don't actually, it sounds absurd if you haven't written one yourself, but I think other authors can relate to this. There's only so much you can do to sort of shape a project. It gains its own momentum, and then you kind of throw up your hands at a certain point. You can't control, especially as a historian, it takes us forever to write books. So you might conceive of a project at one point in the zeitgeist, and then by the time it comes out, it may or may not land, right? But you can control how the book functions as a syllabus for you as a student, right? And we're all kind of continually students. So, to that extent, I found Spellbound, really satisfying, just as a vehicle through which I learned a whole lot about corners of American political and religious history that I just didn't know before.
Yeah.
And I have found that way of thinking of book projects to be kind of liberating, because it's helped me counteract that tendency we all have to focus on, the peanuts that we get, right? The little hits of recognition and acknowledgement that humans thrive on, but which become so addictive in a very damaging way.
Yeah. So if writing a book is somewhat akin to, and I'm going to create an image here, so push back if you don't fully agree with it. It's sort of akin to, I think I'm getting on a horse and I'm going to ride it down a trail, but it turns out I've actually gotten onto a bull and I'm being entered into a ring here, but I have a syllabus that I have developed. What advice then, thinking about the projects you've pursued so far to date, would you offer other historians or other authors?
It is so hard to I mean, to come up with an original thought, right? Like just in general, that there, especially in our current moment when, I mean, on the one hand, I love how we can access, so many publications with the click of a mouse. I love walking into a big bookstore, but I also find the experience depressing because it overwhelms me with the reality of how much quite good intellectual production is out there in the world, and more and more every minute. And here I'm slaving away on my like little brick that I'm adding to the wall, right? Like, why am I doing any of this? So the question, the burden of how can I just have an original thought is one that looms large. And I think you maximize your chances of that, having an original thought, by deciding that there will be some, at least one, if not more, areas of investigation that you will pursue that are perhaps a little bit off the beaten track for your cohort, if you're in a PhD program or your subfield in academia, something that you are a quasi expert in that your colleagues might find maybe slightly eccentric.
Correct.
They certainly don't all have an interest in it, but I think it is through bringing together areas of reading and research that are not typically brought into conversation that we stand the best chance of really making an original contribution. For in my case, I mean, it wasn't particularly strategic, but I was really interested in ancient history and medieval history, and had a strong sense of my own ignorance as someone who just knew almost nothing about Christianity. So I did more homework, you could say, in the earlier history than is perhaps typical for someone who's focused on American religious history. And by the end of my PhD, that did leave me with some big gaps because I hadn't done the spade work in, the ins and outs of the New Deal and, the Civil War. And I was kind of hazy on some basics I had to play catch up on later. But I had done this work on the kind of longue durée of the history of the Christian West that helped me put certain patterns into context in a maybe a fresh way. And I belatedly learned that, that actually made me a historian of ideas, that I was interested instinctively in these kind of long range patterns and intellectual genealogies. So, I think early on, you need to pay attention to, where you have interests that maybe zigzag away from what everyone else is doing, and learn to see that maybe some of those are worth pursuing and may actually produce really original insights.
Thank you. I want to go back to one of the threads in our conversation at the beginning. And unfortunately, our time is beginning to become short here. But as a historian, a journalist, a teacher, and a public intellectual, how do you define the academic vocation? What are the commitments that sort of prove most central to it? And what opportunities have you sought to embrace that will continue to nurture it in that regard?
The point of the academic life is the pursuit of truth. I have been interested in the way in which some of my colleagues in secular academia are actually a little bit jarred by that word truth and would really prefer the word knowledge. So they prefer a narrative of what we're doing that shies away from the notion that we are aiming at universal absolutes in any sense. And rather, can we present a more humble version of our endeavor, which is to offer a kind of continually revised, revelation of new evidence that accumulates and can yield knowledge, but is always subject to revision. And I take their point. I take the value of that humility seriously. But at the same time, part of the current crisis of higher education is the abdication, I think, on the part of secular universities from their traditional, at least in the history of American higher ed, their traditional commitment to forming students as a whole person and attuning students to a broad and ancient conversation about ultimate values. And that to me goes hand in hand with the more modern sort of German research university style, guild governed, discipline specific knowledge building that we're also committed to. And what's so simultaneously frustrating but also exciting about, I think, our current moment in higher ed is this crisis has really kind of come to a head. And I'm having more kind of open, explicit conversations with colleagues and with students about it than I can ever remember having before. I mean, the American university is, has evolved into this kind of weird hybrid of the classic, Christian founded early 19th century American teaching college, usually founded by a Protestant denomination or church organization of some kind, very much focused on forming students' character, passing down received wisdom. The teaching staff was generally, amateurs, young men who were killing time before going on to pursue their own career in law or medicine or the cloth, what have you. A combination of that model with the German research university model that, began to really reach its peak in the middle of the 19th century in Germany and was first imported here in the founding of Johns Hopkins in 1876, which really prioritizes the discovery of new knowledge and research rather than teaching, and sees as its ultimate authority not any religious or philosophical body, but rather the professional guild of experts who recognize one another's expertise. And there's always been tension between the two. The incentive structures are not totally aligned, and then I think is the cause of some of what's really generative and exciting about American higher ed, but also what has gotten so out of whack. So I think we're at a time now where we're really trying to figure that out, and there are a number of kind of different experiments going on in different corners of higher ed to try to do this better. But I do think, returning to that word truth and thinking about how it's different from the pursuit of simply knowledge is an important part of understanding the academic vocation.
In that pursuit of truth, then, have you found that any particular intellectual and or moral virtues are more important perhaps than others to cultivate? Or are there perhaps even any theological virtues that are important to pray to receive in terms of fulfilling that vocation?
Boy, I guess I see the virtues as muscle groups, and focusing on one to the neglect of the others is usually a mistake. What I appreciate so much about my own students is the way they are kind of unselfconsciously curious. And I think that's something that is harder and harder to recapture as you advance in your career, whatever it might be, but is so important. I mean, as a Christian, I don't think don't know if I would label this a virtue, but I think it is so important to remain consistently aware of how weird Christianity is. There's this way in which, especially in our culture, even if you're a secular person, right, and you probably think you know all about Christianity, and what could anyone tell you that would surprise you? But whether you're secular or you've grown up in the church, there's a way in which Christianity's gotten kind of domesticated. It becomes sort of the wallpaper of our culture. But every piece of it is just bananas. I mean, even forget like the Jesus stuff, but even just start with, a personal God who created the universe, but also numbers the hairs on your head and like cares what you had for breakfast this morning. I mean, it's scandalous. It's outrageous. And I do think there's this way in which one has to make a continual effort to remember to just sort of grapple with this, to not let it become overly familiar, and not let the reality of what Christians believe about God's grace to become just part of how the universe works, but to be continually in awe of it. And that does take work, because it's so exhausting to even think about, and it's in the nature of God, right, that we cannot wrap our heads around him. We can only just sort of claw a little bit up the rock face and then slide back down. But there is a way in which you have to commit to continuing to make that effort and be kind of perpetually wide-eyed.
Thank you. I can't help but ask, though, too, as we pursue truth then in the academic vocation, are there any vices against you would caution us to be mindful and to be vigilant about detecting their presence?
Well, gosh, I mean, I think the social scientists have, with every study they've done on, motivated reasoning, they have simply confirmed what the theologians have known for millennia, which is that we have an unbelievable capacity to tune out evidence that does not confirm our presuppositions and our prejudices. And that doesn't, that is sort of universally true. Like it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, or where you are on the political spectrum. I think at particular moments in history, it is more of a problem in some subcultures than others, but it is this kind of universal feature of humans. I think that also is this important discipline of kind of calling ourselves to account. And there's a way in which humans, we naturally self-segregate, right? You find your people. We don't like friction and tension, most of us. And so we tend to surround ourselves with people, whether it's your community at church or, the people that you talk to in your academic department or the newspapers you read. We prefer those that essentially align with us. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, but it's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
And to, prick every so often with a dose of something from the outside.
Yeah. Thank you. For our last question then today, I want to ask you, in what ways do you believe historians then moving forward, especially historians for those who are Christian, can be of greater service to the church, but then also in what ways can the church be of greater service to historians?
I think that Americans generally, and maybe this is especially true of evangelical Protestants, of which I am one, we tend to both simultaneously sort of fetishize a tidy, kind of convenient and propagandistic version of history without really having a high degree of awareness of ourselves as historical subjects. And I think there is this false notion that to study history seriously leads inevitably into a kind of cultural relativism in which everything is a product of its historical moment and there's no truth. And that is totally at odds with, the foundational fact of Christianity, which is that it is a story of God entering history at a specific moment in time. So, I think, I guess I think that the church can help historians remain continually aware of the stakes of history in this sense, and the way in which, Christianity it's not just like every other world religion. It's a specific, it's unique in its reckoning with the human incapacity to save ourselves, but it's also unique in that it is a story about history. And in some ways, it's like the most exciting religion if you're a historian. This has been the view that I've come to. Historians, for their part, I think they need to be aware of some of the trends in their own subfields and the ways in which being a useful historian for the church does require stepping up and above what happens to be in vogue and fashionable. Right now it is very fashionable to study and define conservative Protestants, especially in terms of what they consume, in terms of kind of, capitalism and how they fit into capitalism and what they buy at Walmart and so forth. And all that's interesting and important. But, fashions in academia, they're like fashions in New York boutiques, right? Like they swing far in one direction and leave behind a lot of great stuff in other directions. So I think pondering one's vocation as a historian who operates in the classroom but is also trying to be of service to the church should result in a kind of doubly strong call to be cognizant of and somewhat immune to the fashions of our disciplines and see that there's kind of wisdom from all these different types of approaches to the human predicament.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our guest has been Molly Worthen, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you for taking the time to share your insights and wisdom with us.
Thanks. This has been fun.
Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.